All right, I think we're live, and good evening, everyone. I'm joined with my friend Classical Theist tonight, talking about some of the quite common objections that we both hear to natural theology primarily. Classical Theist, would you like to maybe introduce yourself first before we get started?
Yeah. I have a YouTube channel where I dedicate it to kind of combating secular philosophies, whether they be political, speculative, uh, from a from the standpoint of both classical theism on one hand and Thomistic philosophy on the other. Philosophy of St. Thomas Aquinas and that medieval scholastic tradition. Um, and Yeah, that's pretty much what I do on my channel. I also try to defend Christianity, defend Catholicism, those kinds of things. Um, so yeah,
All right, very good.
as to whether or not I'm sick, I actually live with a dog that I'm allergic to, so I've been congested perpetually for like a few years. So yeah.
All right, well, so perhaps we can just jump right into it. So I think Classical Theist and I, we compiled a list of some of the most common objections that we hear, because both of us are interested in the philosophical arguments for
Hmm.
classical theism. So perhaps you could suggest one common objection that you hear.
Yeah, I have a little list here. The first one is there's no evidence for the existence of God, and of course, we could go through all the arguments, we could go through all the proofs, but I think one important thing to point out is that I think it's phrased in a way that sort of that gives the atheist, I think, uh, too much leeway, because it kind of presupposes that talking about is the only kind of rational justification that can be accepted in these kinds of discussions. And that would be, of course, a rational justification as through the prism of the scientific method, um, you know, uh, testable experimentation based on strictly empirical phenomena and drawing the conclusions from that. And I think that's fallacious. And we can, of course, get into why right now if you want.
Yeah, I mean, my response to that would initially have the atheists, they often restrict the notion of evidence to what they can personally see or what was empirically verifiable. But
Hmm.
I think the objection goes a little bit too far to begin with, because even for a lot of false propositions, it's a bit hyperbolic to say that there's absolutely no evidence for the proposition.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, like for example, I'm not a 9/11 truther. There is evidence in favor of the 9/11 truther position. There's evidence that we can look at. There's evidence that we can weigh it one way or the other, analyze, discern. So this is just flatly no evidence for God is just even on the strictly empirical level. I mean, there have been a lot of miraculous claims, a lot of claims of miracles. That would clearly be an indication, and then they're all tethered to certain religious traditions. That would obviously count as evidence, and I put air quotes. Of course, can't see that, but you know, but the more fundamental point, I think, would be, uh, and then of course this has been iterated many times in apologetic circles, of course, but uh, the proposition, of course, is just self-refuting. You can't empirically verify the proposition that the only acceptable body of rational justification would only come through the scientific method. You cannot prove that via the scientific method. It's just impossible. Um, and since that is impossible, we have therefore arrived at a truth, namely that it is impossible through a method other than a scientific method. So it just completely implodes on itself. You know.
Yeah, Yeah, another example of another false proposition that at least has a modicum of evidence is the flat Earth position. I mean,
Yeah,
if you
yeah.
just
Or
take a look
just
outside right now, yeah,
geocentrism, right? I mean,
yeah,
I think that's a little bit more of a respectable false proposition. Um,
hmm
there are a lot of people who make rather sophisticated arguments for geocentrism. Uh, you have, and it requires specific scientific instruments that were not available until recently. I mean, I don't mean recently in terms of contemporary history. I mean in terms of centuries, um, to verify the heliocentric model. So the point is, it's just wrong to say there's no evidence for the existence of God. I mean, you have a lot of miraculous claims. Like I said, you have. Um, I mean, you can even look at modern cosmology. I don't like arguing for God from modern cosmology. I much prefer the metaphysical, philosophical arguments because I think they're much more certain. And maybe we can get into justification for metaphysics in a second if you want. But just on the scientific level, uh, I think atheists should concede, even if they don't accept the existence of God. I think for the sake of their own intellectual credibility, they should concede that there is at least evidence, even if they examine the evidence and ultimately reject the conclusion. You know, so
yeah, yeah. Like I said, I mean, I think there's definitely some at least some evidence for, I mean, the flat Earth position, the geocentrism. I think actually someone mentioned in the chat too that in a way geocentrism is too because of relativity. I mean, you can always switch up the
hmm
coordinate systems to make the
yeah,
Earth
yeah,
stationary.
right, yeah, that's true.
And even with Ptolemy's system too, I mean, you can always add in more epicycles if you wanted to.
hmm
So,
So
I
that's
mean,
true.
just
Yeah, yeah,
if you want to do some
yeah,
trolling on
yeah,
that
yeah, yeah.
on that end,
You could definitely do that. Um, I mean,
it works. I mean, it has predictive power, right? So I mean, the
mhm,
math must indicate that it works.
right,
I
exactly.
mean,
So even on
the Earth
that
is
front
stationary.
alone, even on that front alone, they're mistaken. We haven't even gotten to the fact that metaphysics is a discipline that you cannot discount, right? Uh, I said this on Twitter a number of days ago that if you reject metaphysics, what you're actually doing is you are rejecting the proposition that we can study into terms that we use, terms that we take for granted. Like, for example, being. Of course, metaphysics, according to Aristotle, is the study of being as being, right? Um, being, causation, uh, the even the word is, um, met many other ones too, uh, that we take for granted. We use in our everyday language. That uh, what the anti-metaphysician is really asking us to do is uh, refuse to actually study what those terms actually mean in their own right via logical analysis. So if he wants to tell us to do that, then I don't think on rational grounds he can justify using those terms, which he definitely uses. Uh, you know, cause, essence, thing, being, is, nothing. These are all words that are metaphysical. These are words that come prior to any particularized empirical phenomenon that we may or may not investigate, right? So if we're not allowed to study those terms, those concepts in and of themselves, in their own right, as the proper object of the science of metaphysics, then it seems to me that, since to remove a cause is to also remove an effect, the effect that comes as a result of using those terms, which is really everyday empirical phenomenon, right? We can't talk about empirical phenomena without using those concepts, without having recourse to those concepts. Then science also goes out the window because it's dependent upon these self-evident principles. And it's studying those self-evident principles, being, change, essence, existence, these types of things, causality in itself, that get to the existence of God. And it's those arguments that I think are most certain. So there is not only evidence for God, but there's certain proof for through the method that they fallaciously reject.
Yeah, I
Sorry
mean,
to go
I
on a
agree.
tangent.
That's fine. I think was it Etienne Gilson who said that metaphysics has a way of burying its undertakers.
Yeah. That's a
Have you heard
beautifully
that quote?
said thing. I've heard that before.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so once you deny metaphysics, I mean, in a way, you set up another metaphysical position, then by it,
Exactly. Yeah.
like
You're
one
using
way or another.
metaphysics to because well, what you're doing is you're saying that you're making a claim about reality as such. You're saying that reality as such is not amenable to metaphysical analysis. You're saying you're saying and that to make a claim about reality in those generic universal terms is to make a metaphysical statement because you're not gleaning that anti-metaphysical prejudice based upon any particular empirical phenomenon that you may or may not have tested experimentally. No testable experimentation can yield that conclusion. It simply can't. You have to make a philosophical argument. And you know, there are philosophical arguments you can certainly use to discount or undercut, particularly Thomistic metaphysics. I mean, honestly, one interesting thing I find is that the most challenging objections to my worldview, to my Thomistic worldview, they don't come from these fedora tipping atheists. They come from other scholastics. They come from other scholastics who were either contemporaneous with Aquinas or lived after Aquinas, who really developed the most sophisticated arguments against St. Thomas's position. It doesn't come from fedora tipper 88 or Dawkins fan, you know, whatever. It just doesn't come from them. If you want attacks on Aquinas, look at I don't know, Scotism or William of Ockham. Of course, I don't think William of Ockham is that much of a threat, but nevertheless, any critique of William of Ockham against Thomism is infinitely more valuable than anything you'll read in Dawkins. But yeah. Anyway,
Yeah,
we can move on to the next one.
yeah, and that's just in the West too. I think the Orthodox they have serious
Yeah.
problems with Thomism too. So
They do. They do indeed. Yeah. Yeah, that's true.
so I mean, yeah, there are certainly good in-house objections that one could raise, but yeah, like you said, I don't think any of these like the common stuff really poses a threat to like the serious classical tradition. But yeah, I think that I think I had that on my list too. That that this metaphysical position, which makes a claim that there are no metaphysical positions or that they're all unintelligible.
Yeah.
Which I mean, how do you even come to that position in the first place? I propose an argument like that.
Yeah.
Because it seems like you would have to raise yourself up to that metaphysical position to survey everything and then say, yes, there's no. I mean, it's the same problem with. It's one problem I have with physicalism or naturalism too.
Exactly.
Is that how do you even set up the position? Like you would have to take a supernatural vantage just to survey the landscape.
Exactly.
And then you would have to come to this conclusion that there's nothing beyond the physical or there's nothing beyond the natural. So I mean, just even as a positive argument for it.
Yeah, exactly.
That's not going to hold any water. There has to be something more than that.
And that phrase you just used, surveying everything, that is essentially how Aristotle defines metaphysics. He defines it as being as such, being qua Latin for as, being as being, the most generic of genera. And like you said, you have to survey everything, study being as being. In order to reject the study of being as being, that's clearly ridiculous. So,
how about so another probably the most common. I'm not even sure I would call this an objection, but it's a question.
Yeah.
So what do you make of that one? Who made God, or who
okay.
Who caused God?
You kind of cut out there, but I got the question now. Yeah, that's completely okay. It's understandable, and I'll say it's understandable because there are, as you talked about in your videos, as I talk about in my videos, there are two kind of competing visions of the divine. Theistic personalism on the one hand and classical theism on the other hand. I think for theistic personalism, which regards God as essentially composite, composed of his attributes, essentially, God has maximal greatness, maximal wisdom, maximal power, maximal intelligence, uh, maximal existence or whatever. If you hold that view, and then that these attributes are really distinct from one another, I think the "who made God" objection can kind of work, because, of course, it would have to work, because uh, if you say that God is composed of his attributes in that way, then he is contingent upon those attributes as parts of himself, and those parts would be dependent upon the whole, the unity of the whole, the unity of the divine essence, and it would just collapse. And so you would have to ask the question, well, where's the extrinsic cause for the divine? So it's understandable on that front. But that's only if you don't do your homework and you just listen to William Lane Craig videos and think you've completely surveyed the entire theistic tradition. But you haven't. With classical theism, you have this wonderful doctrine called divine simplicity, which is to say that all of God's attributes, his wisdom, intelligence, power, knowledge, etc., they're all fundamentally the same thing. They're all ultimately reflective of the same thing from different intellectual vantage points of a finite being. I like to use the example of a prism of light, where you have God's essence, which is the same as existence. But when it's perceived through a finite intellect, similar to the prism, the light diversifies into colors, and those that diversification of color is very much analogous to the diversification of attributes of God. So since we have this divine simplicity doctrine that God is really not composed of parts, the objection of who caused God really falls apart, because divine simplicity allows us to say that God is truly ultimate, truly metaphysically ultimate, beyond whom is non-being, essentially. You have anything to add to that? I'm sure you do.
Yeah, I guess what I would add is that if you listen to some of the standard, say, the cosmological arguments, if you take like say, Thomas's first way, the argument for motion, which makes a conclusion to pure act, something which is devoid of potential. In this tradition, the question doesn't even make a whole lot of sense when it's even phrased. Ask, if you take the argument for motion, for example, the relevant question would be, who moved God? But then once you translate, you analyze what that means. You're asking, what actualizes the potentials of that which not even in principle could have any potentials to be actualized?
Essentially, who actualized pure actuality, right? It just doesn't make any sense.
What potentials in that which has no potentials to be actualized were actualized?
I mean, okay, you can criticize the arguments, you can criticize St. Thomas's arguments, you can criticize Aristotle's arguments, but you have to actually make sure you're critiquing the actual argument. I have a Summa, a copy of the Summa in front of me, and question 3 of the Summa, already you get to the simplicity of God, how we can say that God is not composed of any parts, and it's a detailed response to the obvious question of, if we have this terminus, namely pure act, pure actuality, subsistent existence, which we call God, would that not demand an extrinsic cause, and how does that really terminate our regress? Well, St. Thomas explains how that does terminate the regress. It terminates the regress because pure actuality or subsistent existence is such that it must lack, given the logic of how we get to that conclusion, it must lack that which makes it existentially insufficient, that which makes it contingent, essentially, that which makes it a cause. We're robbing those attributes that would make him contingent, and that's derivative of the actual arguments themselves. And it's not just a tag along at the end, right?
Yeah, so
it's like, oh, we have this God at the end, and we're just going to explain him away as something that no, it's not that. It's the conclusion is such that his non-contingency, his unconditioned ontological status, his status of being that which is metaphysically ultimate, that which requires no extrinsic cause. Those are implications of the actual argument itself.
Yeah, so it seems like a good question in the sense that it to push the question all the way back and see what the divine nature has to look like.
Yeah.
When you carried out these arguments to their conclusions, like in the argument for motion, you keep asking that question just to make sure the conclusion you have actually does correspond with that could not in principle be actualized any further.
Yeah, right.
Composition, that which is non-composite, because if it were composite, it would indeed require a prior cause. So exactly. Perhaps a question might be good as like a check to make sure you've actually hit the most fundamental level.
Yeah,
as opposed to like
you're right.
like a lowercase g god, like a local power.
Yeah. The glorified Zeus. You know.
Yeah. Actually, that's one objection. Go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead. Give that objection.
Yeah, so this is one objection you and I hear a lot too. I'm not sure quite where this started, but I know Dawkins brings this up quite a bit. That there have been many Greek gods in the past, lowercase g gods. There have been many of these gods in the past, such as Hermes, and Zeus. But see, what I do is I just go one god further and I reject yours too.
Right. Yeah. We just reject one less pure actuality.
Yeah. See, this is another example. Like, when you analyze this tradition, it doesn't. The statement doesn't even make any sense.
Yeah.
Like
it doesn't.
Yeah. So when you substitute uppercase G God in that statement with something like pure act, Tom's term, ipsum esse subsistens, the subsistent act of to be itself.
That's good Latin.
That's back in the day, so I'm well equipped for the
the
papist pronunciation. So so if you take St. Thomas's term, the ipsum esse, there couldn't even in principle be more than one of such things. So the objection loses any force because the objection is based on this notion that you're conjuring up different level powers, so reject them all. But like ipsum esse or pure act, only such a thing. So the question is either is there one or is there not?
Right, and the thing is when you use the word God in natural theology, when we use that word, I think a lot of atheists are under the impression that you get to the end of the argument, and then you have this abstract conclusion, and then we just shoehorn godness into that concept, right? We just insert godness, I guess, into that abstract conclusion that we reached at the end of the argument. Well, that's exactly not what we're doing. We're saying that when you have this conclusion, say a pure actuality or subsistent existence itself, the word God at that point is just a nominal label that we're attaching to the conclusion. It's the conclusion itself that you have to look at. And we're saying that the divine attributes of omnipotence, omniscience, all these things, is derivative of the actual conclusion of the argument, of pure actuality, of subsistent existence itself. And the word God is that label that we're going to attach to the concept. But the label in itself is nothing. It's the concept itself that is significant.
Yeah, that's something I hear quite a bit too. Like, so be talking to people, and they but then they ask, "Oh, well, why call it God?"
Yeah,
you're arguing names at that point. I mean, it doesn't matter like what you call that. Like you use the symbols like God. I mean, Latin to say Deus or I mean, well, like you said, what we're trying to do is just identify that which is coming out at the conclusion of these.
Mm-hmm.
We're trying to point to something, even though it's pointing is metaphorical. Something that's coming out of the conclusion, like that which is ultimately simple, not made of parts, which is first cause. Like that's what we're trying to get at here. I mean, the argument that why call it God isn't really. I mean, there's got to be something more to it than that. Than
Right.
objecting to the name.
Yeah. So got another objection here. I think this is a good one because I think this is something that I think you hear all the time, not just some of the time, but all the time. That is, the universe. Well, what if the universe has always existed? What does that account to, faith equals smashed? If the universe always existed, does that mean that all your arguments are silly and then they don't make any sense? And no. You can tackle that one if you want.
Oh, about the eternality of the universe?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting because I mean, I think Aristotle believed the universe was eternal, right? He still accepted that there was a prime mover. And
St. Thomas,
more recently, I don't think Aquinas even thought you can prove by philosophical means that the universe had a beginning.
He didn't think you could do it. Yeah.
I think St. Bonaventure thought you could, right?
Yeah, he did. So St. Bonaventure had his own proof for that.
But
St. Thomas, he said he was philosophically, of course he believed the universe had a beginning given his faith, but philosophically agnostic on the issue.
Mm-hmm. It's also interesting too, if you take, I think right around that time, Avicenna, in the Islamic tradition, like he has a few arguments which I think are actually correct, like his contingency argument, which does establish that there is necessary being. And Avicenna doesn't even, I think Avicenna thought the universe was eternal.
Did he? I think that's correct, but I don't exactly recall. Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's nothing. Yeah. I
think most Muslims accept that the want to make that claim. I don't know if they believe that the universe is eternal or not, but I think Avicenna said he accepted that the universe was eternal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the thing is, like, all of these arguments that we're using, at least, of course, there are arguments for God's existence that do require the universe not be eternal. But for all the ones that I advocate, for the ones that I'm sure you advocate, you don't need, the premise is not required. The argument works with or without. The argument could be just eternal in the past, but you would still, to account for change, for example, you would still have to posit pure actuality to solve the Parmenidean conundrum of how you can account for change, logically speaking. Parmenidean, of course, for Parmenides, the Greek the pre-Socratic philosopher, who basically argued that change was impossible given his own rationalistic proof. And Aristotle answers that conundrum. I don't know if you want to get into that, but he answers it by dividing reality into actuality and potentiality, and that's pretty much the structure of change. And within that structure, you can derive pure actuality if you buy his argument. But that is not, the point is, that's not contingent upon the universe having a beginning. It simply isn't. The universe could just be eternal in the past, but you would still, given the nature of change itself, which even if the universe is eternal, you would still have to account for. You still get the conclusion, and you get the conclusion with all the other arguments too.
Yeah, it seems that so long as there exists anything that is either in motion in the here and now, that some potency is being actualized, or whether there's something that's composite, or whether there's something in which essence is distinct from existence, you have to come back to. You have to run through the argument, and you conclude either with subsistent existence itself, or something which is ultimately simple, or that which is actualizer. So none of these arguments, it's not tracing like a series backward into the past, like an accidentally ordered series, as we say.
Yeah, exactly. Well, what I understand is, why don't these people just read the premises of the argument? I mean, nowhere in any of the premises do you find the universe had a beginning, except in, of course, the Kalam cosmological argument. But that's not what we're talking about. You don't find it anywhere in Aquinas, in his arguments. He never. That's not a premise. It's simply not a premise. I can understand you getting confused about it, given the word motion, which I think is problematic because it's lumped in with linear motion, right? But yeah, it's just not in the premises.
Yeah, I was just thinking this beginning of the universe might be tied into the deism that we've
I
seen
think so.
coming out of like Enlightenment era philosophy.
Yeah,
Because
right.
a lot of those guys were just deists, and they kind of they thought of God not so much as a sustaining cause as like a classical theist, but
Uh-huh.
as like a divine watchmaker, which set up the initial conditions and he just let the thing go, and he just left the scene.
Yeah, I find it fascinating because uh, the deists, they chose deism because they thought, I suppose, it was more rational than theism. But I think if you're committed to deism, then you have the evidence problem, right? You have the evidence problem because at that point, the deist god would simply be a glorified Zeus. He created the world, and then through, I assume, a succession of mental changes, he decided to leave it to leave it alone. That requires change, so that necessarily requires composition, I think. Uh, it basically makes the deist god a particularized object, which we do not believe God is, because of course, according to Aquinas, God is not in a genus or even in a species or anything like that. God is simply the subsistent active being itself, which is the plenitude of existence, in whom every particular object that exists participates in by virtue of that shared property of existence. That you don't find that in deism. I mean, deism is you have this singular entity called, as David Bentley Hart would say, Mr. God, and he created the world at some point and let it go. That you really get the evidence problem with that. There's no necessary metaphysical argument that can get you to deism, because the deist God is, I think, an entity that would be amenable to empirical investigation, not metaphysical proof.
Yeah, like on this topic, I think David Bentley Hart's a great resource. You mentioned the Mr. God.
Yeah, yeah,
It's a delightful phrase too. He says that this well, he calls him the Demiurge too, because I think this is kind of a reincarnation of the Demiurge idea.
yeah.
That this Mr. God, he's the most exalted individual in the natural order, and he has a number of uncanny powers.
Yeah,
Get to
that was a
his
great
theist
way to
argument.
put it. That was a great way to put it.
That even on the theistic side,
Mhm.
it seems that if you take like an intelligent design argument,
Yeah,
that I think even if that argument works, like if you, like an idea argument that
uh-huh.
complex, and it's very likely that on its own it came about by natural processes.
Yeah,
So there must be an extremely powerful force
yeah. I mean,
which
that I
generated
think
this. I mean,
that
that doesn't get you like classical theism or
no,
anything like that. It just gets you into an extremely
I think
powerful force.
I think that's a disruption of classical theism, actually. Um, and honestly, I think at that point Dawkins would be right that I think aliens would be more likely. You know, uh,
But yeah, like
if
you
you,
said,
yeah,
it kind
if
of
you,
relegates it to like a scientific hypothesis.
yeah, exactly, because
So aliens is like the hypothesis number two. It's either
yeah,
Mr. God or it's aliens.
exactly. See, if you're treating life as just a mechanistic complex, uh, like a glorified machine, then uh, I think if you're looking for a cause for that simply based on the complexity of it, I think it would violate Occam's razor to posit this enormously complex being to answer that question. Um, and it's and it kind of irks me because a lot of people confuse the intelligent design argument for Aquinas' fifth way. When they are not the same at all.
Yeah. Yeah, like I was saying, or as you were saying actually, that this Mr. God, he's kind of like a scientific hypothesis that he would be amenable to pointing a telescope
Yeah.
at Mr. God, and then he's like an alternative would be the alien hypothesis.
Yeah.
But actually, you brought up Dawkins. I think Dawkins actually has a really powerful argument in favor of divine simplicity.
Yeah, yeah, he does.
There being
He
an
does.
extremely complex machine that's highly unlikely
Uh-huh.
to come about by itself.
Yeah, he basically proves that you can't have an infinite regress of composed beings, of beings that are composed of parts, of complexity. You can't have it. You has to. And interestingly enough, I think you talked about it in your last live stream, and I wanted to reiterate it. It seems like what a lot of these atheists are really looking for in terms of their uh, scope of explanatory purpose and trying to get at uh, ultimate answers. What they're really trying to do is they're trying to reduce complexity to simplicity. Lawrence Krauss attempts to do it with his thesis and on a universe from nothing, uh, and his answer at the end of the day is that which lacks uh, particles, lacks matter, energy, space, all of these physical limitations, right? And I could be wrong, but it's either him or someone else that I listened to on the topic. He says what's ultimately left is the potential to exist. He or someone else used that exact same phrase, and that struck me because if you try to translate that into classical theist categories, that is translatable. That is very much translatable because we would eventually arrive at what is divine simplicity, but reducing the divine to a simple active being, active source of being, and whose divine essence is ultimately the same as his power. And that concept, I think, conceptually is very much agreeable to at least what they appear to be looking for.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think Dawkins. Well, I know you and I like to cite Phaser's new book.
Yeah.
So on this topic, he has an argument from composition to that which is non-composite. He calls it the Neoplatonic proof, but
Yeah,
I think Dawkins may have got him on this. Yeah,
Dawkins should absolutely love it.
yeah. I mean, Phaser could have just yanked Dawkins' argument straight from the God delusion, just made a few changes to make it actually a logically valid argument. Because I mean, Dawkins doesn't write in logically coherent terms. So
this person asks, why is the simplicity of physical systems rigorous proof of the simplicity of the wholly metaphysical? Well, it's not. But my point in bringing that up was that, first of all, I don't think these atheist popularizers of cosmology, I don't think they think in philosophical terms very often. I don't think they would make even think to make the connection I'm making. What my point in saying that was, I think that they, without considering the philosophical implications, they are searching for explanations that ultimately reduce from complexity to simplicity. And I think that tendency is very much agreeable in classical theist methodologies.
Yeah, I mean, certainly a conception of God which has like a huge machine and a giant subjectivity is going to be pretty repugnant intellectually.
Yeah, it is.
It will fall prey to someone like Dawkins' argument. Like, how does that thing come about? How does this giant machine or this complex subjectivity come about?
It's very interesting how they're just reiterating the fact. They're reiterating the principle of sufficient reason, if you want. They're depending on it, but they just don't take it all the way. Mm-hmm. So you have another objection that you want to go through?
Sure. So this is a slightly more sophisticated. So this is the stone paradox.
Yeah.
So this is trying to consider a stone so heavy that God cannot lift it. So the atheist will ask something like, he'll say that, okay, if God exists, then he's omnipotent.
Yeah.
But consider, can God make a stone so heavy that he can't lift it?
Right.
And there are a number of different forms of this. Some are more amusing than others, such as one that I heard was, can God microwave a burrito so hot that he can't eat it?
Yeah.
That even he can't eat it.
Ones like that, yeah.
But they're all variants of that formulation. So
Yeah,
So
it's
yeah, so the
clever when
atheists will
you're in the
say,
ninth
well,
grade, but
yeah, yeah. So the atheists will say, okay, do it if he can make the stone, then he can't lift it, so he's not omnipotent. But if he can't make the stone to begin with, then he's not omnipotent there either. And because he's not omnipotent, then he can't exist.
Yeah.
So the classic stone paradox. So what say ye to that?
Yeah, I think it makes the mistake of conflating power for human beings or for material objects and the power of God. When those two things are related, but of course in our tradition we have the principle of analogy, whereby when we say that God has an attribute, it's similar to an attribute that may inhere in, say, a human being, like intelligence, but it's not the same. It's not the same thing. We're not talking about the same thing. And when we talk about God's power, well, what are we really talking about? Well, we're talking about his. Essentially, it's one and the same with his essence. And what is his essence? The subsistent act of existence itself. Now, when you look at that concept, the subsistent act of existence itself, you have to come to the realization that power itself is defined in and through the power to actuate, right? The power to really reduce from potentiality to actuality, right? That's essentially what power is. It's the capability to reduce something from a state of potentiality to actuality. If I have the power to, I don't know, engage in an Olympic swimming contest, what I'm essentially doing is I'm reducing my potentiality to swim that fast, to actually swimming that fast. And if we say that God is pure actuality, then he would have to be that unconditioned source of that through which power itself is possible in the first place. And so for that reason, that he would have the power to actualize anything that could, in principle, be actualized, because he is actuality itself. That's one way to get it. I think that's the most fundamental way to get at it. And of course, you could also say, what William Lane Craig would say, and he would say that, what you just listed is a contradiction in terms, and I think he's right, and that would be logically incoherent, and logical incoherency has no referent in reality. So it's just, it's essentially, it's impossible to refute because the refutation doesn't have real ontological status because it's incoherent. It doesn't make sense.
Yeah, I mean, the logical incoherence would be my answer to the stone paradox. I think, just because it's
I think
very
that's the
simple.
quickest and easiest way. But I think it's also important to draw the fact that power itself is defined by the act potency distinction, the actuality potentiality distinction. And if we said that God is pure actuality, then of course he has to be that principle upon which power itself is grounded.
Yeah, and in form, the stone paradox is really no different than asking whether God can make a four-sided triangle.
Exactly. Yeah.
Something
and it's just, yeah.
But yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, it's just incoherent, as you were saying.
Yeah. Well, there's one delightful response. I think this comes from. I know Phaser has it in his book, but there's someone else who gave this objection to, or it wasn't an objection, just an observation that if the atheist insists or to actuate logical contradictions, here's the result. God can create the stone so heavy that he can't lift, but what he can do is he can go on to lift that stone that's so heavy that he can't lift it, because, I mean, we've just accepted logical contradictions now. So he can both create the stone, he can lift it, but here's the additional thing. So the atheist is trying to put forth an argument. The atheist is trying to put forth an argument that because his argument is true, it shows that God does not exist. But since we're allowing contradictions,
we could just contradict back. Yeah.
Yeah. The argument says he can't exist, but God can make himself exist, even when the argument says he can't. So that's what happens when you allow a contradiction in there.
Yeah. As Avicenna said, I think, if he who denies the principle of non-contradiction should be beaten and burned until he admits that to be burned is not the same as not to be burned, and to be beaten is not the same as not to be beaten. So I live by that maxim every day.
Yeah. Based Avicenna.
Yeah. Based Avicenna. He,
Yeah,
I mean, he was. I mean, that is a quality medieval meme. I mean,
yeah. I mean, there you go. I mean, people ask for a demonstration of the law of non-contradiction.
well,
So
there you have it.
I mean, if you ask Avicenna, we can demonstrate it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll have to look up who. Yeah, because I remember
Let's
Phaser
pick
had
the
that.
amazing atheist for a volunteer. No, I'm just joking. But yeah.
But yeah, that's one
He's not
delightful
relevant
response to
anymore.
the. Yeah, but that's kind of one delightful response to the omnipotence paradox. That if you really want, if the atheist is so insistent,
Yeah.
on blocking arguments for God's existence, if he wants to admit the illogical contradiction, then he's gotten rid of any right that he has to appeal to logic, because the argument he's trying to put forth is saying that God cannot exist, given his argument. But lo and behold, because we've allowed logical contradictions, God can make himself exist even when the argument says he can't. So
yeah,
so there you go.
Mean, we can just contradict back, essentially.
Yeah. So you have the stone paradox. I think it's your turn now. Do you have an objection?
Ah, yes. Okay. How about this? You don't need God to be a good person one. I think this is important because, again, it's one that you hear everywhere. It's one that is, without exception, something that atheists will tell you. I think that's a good one. You want to tackle that first, and I'll add to it.
I mean, it's true in a sense.
Yeah.
I think perhaps the atheist there, he's thinking more along the lines of something like divine command theory, that you need direct commandments at every time to know what's right and wrong. Whereas I think you and I are more, well, we're both Catholics, so we're probably more sympathetic to like a natural law understanding of morality. So I mean, certainly, like, you and I are not going to say something like you need you need direct interference by God's will at every moment to know what's right and wrong. That we have an innate cognition of that which is right and wrong, and we can come to these conclusions just by natural reason alone.
Right.
Like, so in a sense, yeah, I mean, the atheist is correct there, but it's an important concern. Strictly speaking, I don't think it logically gets you to the conclusion that God doesn't exist.
Right.
But it's an important concern.
It is important.
When we're talking about morality.
Everyone brings it up too. I mean, what I would say is also that while it is, in a sense, true that you don't need God to be God to be good, it's trivially true. Again, you and I reject the divine command theory, so we can throw that out on the outset. What I would say, though, is that what they do lack is an ontological justification for the good in itself. It would ultimately break down to a metaphysical argument. If you say that an action is good, what are you really saying about that action? You're saying that it is in conformity to some ontological standard that is beyond you. Well, what is that ontological standard? Is it can you find it in the materialist reduction to atoms in the void? I don't think you can. I think it would also, kind of touch on Aquinas' fourth way, whereby I think he defines the good the best way, where he says that goodness is ultimately the same as being. And that's because if you say something is good, you're essentially saying that it is it is perfected in some way. A thing has reached a state of perfection, and we call it good because of that reason. But perfection, you can't understand what perfection is without getting into actuality and potentiality. There's that distinction again. It's so crucial and all pervasive, because when you say that something is perfected, you're saying that it has been actualized in some way. Because, for example, triangularity. If you draw a poorly drawn triangle, why is it imperfect? Why is it bad? It's because it has not conformed to the geometrical definitional limits of that makes triangularity triangularity. You have not done that. And for that reason, the triangle is bad. But if you do that, then the triangle is good. So it's actuality. It's a thing being essentially what it is, what it yearns to be by nature. That fulfillment of a thing to its natural end, because it makes it actual, given its nature. And for that reason, you need a source for that actuality itself. If many things can share this property of actuality, then it just necessarily follows that if many things are sharing the same thing, then that property that they all share can be spoken of in its own right, and it has to have some prior existence because everything is shared by it, or everything shares in it, rather. So you have to speak of the actuality or being as such, unconditioned, unlimited, in itself, in its own right. And it's only when you do that that you can have a justification for the good, for something, for goodness being an objective feature of reality. And if you don't have it, so in a sense, you cannot be good without God, but in another sense, you can be. And epistemologically, you can know the good without God, but ontologically, you cannot have the good. You cannot have goodness. You cannot have a good act, shall we say, without the source of goodness itself, which is ultimately being itself, because I've just demonstrated that the two are one collapses into the other.
Yeah, I guess on the atheist side, you're saying this ultimately comes down to what the arguments are trying to get at. We're trying to get at that which makes it possible for there to be any good things at all, not so much coming to know the good. I think perhaps it is like the theist's fault when they make the argument that they don't make this
It's true. Yeah.
distinction clear. Because, I mean, I know some would say, I don't know if Ken Ham would do something like this, but oh, well, you can't do anything that's good at all if you're an atheist.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I guess the misunderstanding is
an interesting thing about this. An interesting thing about this, I think, is that how atheists will often say that we anthropomorphize everything. We make everything about humanity. We make the universe just about humanity. And we'll get to that objection. But the interesting thing is that this Thomistic Catholic system of ethics is actually not anthropomorphic, because I've just shown that when we speak of something that's morally good, it's morally good in a very almost the same way that we would say a triangle is good, or a anything that can conform to its nature properly would be good. It's the same goodness, right? It's the same actuality. It's the same metaphysical principle that is in the triangle, that is in the tree, that is in the rock, that is in the dog. That's in us. For us, we just, the only difference with us is that it ultimately can reach the divine himself, because we have the faculties of intellect and will, which they don't go after particular true things or particular good things. Of course they do, but not ultimately. They ultimately yearn for the truth itself and goodness as such, and that's the difference that makes humans distinct. But it's the same. It is a participation in the same metaphysical wellspring that the tree participates in, and the rock participates in, and all these other things that we have in nature. So it's really not anthropomorphic. Whereas the atheist, I think, if he says there's a moral goodness and that you can talk about it and it's real, that has to be anthropomorphic. It has to be centered on human individuals, that somehow there's this metaphysical reality called goodness that is just tethered to them. That's anthropomorphism. We're not the anthropomorphists with that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think that's all I had to say on that one.
Mhm.
So I've got another pretty interesting objection, I think. So how about this one, that perhaps the universe itself, taken as a totality, could be self-sustaining,
Mhm.
necessary being, and it doesn't require any sort of cause or anything like that. So there's no need
Mhm.
for this God stuff that we're talking about.
Yeah. You want to tackle that one first?
Well, I mean, a couple ways I think we can respond to this one. So, in a way, this seems to be granting the theistic conclusion that there must exist necessary being.
Yeah.
So this kind of makes the objector a pantheist already, but he's just identifying the divine
Yeah.
nature with the totality of the universe,
Right.
which that raises other problems because we know by other arguments too that that which is subsistent existence itself must also be non-composite.
Yeah.
So then the atheist has to say, I guess the pantheist has to say that the universe is actually non-composite, that it's not actually made of parts at all.
Yeah. Like
I
you
mean,
say.
that's just look around.
Yeah. Like you
It's
say.
refuted.
They've granted the logic of the argument, and that's the hardest step, is to grant the logic of the argument. I think the other steps of deriving divine attributes are actually fairly simple, because you simply get it from robbing this necessary being of everything that would make it susceptible to the argument, right? That would make it susceptible to that which needs a cause, that which needs an extrinsic metaphysical ground, right? Uh, And we look and we see that composition is one of those things. Composition is something that makes a thing contingent, that makes a thing dependent. And if that makes a thing dependent, contingency, or rather composition makes a thing dependent, then we have to ask ourselves, how would we describe a reality that is truly not composite, that is truly not composed of any parts whatsoever? Um, And I think you would ultimately have to conclude that it would have to be a reality whose essence, what it is simply none other than the fact that it exists. Because existence is, you can't go any further than existence. You can't, because anything beyond pure existence as such can only be nothing, can only be non-being. Pre-Socratics have taught us. That's something that Aristotle and Plato have taught us. That if you try to go beyond being itself, then you can only have non-being after that. And I think through logical calculus, through metaphysical analysis, you would ultimately come to the conclusion that the only thing that can truly be simple, that can truly be non-composite, that truly be ultimate, is that which just is the subsistent act of existence itself. And then we can derive the other implications that would flow from that. I think one of the hardest ones, I think maybe we could tackle this objection that's kind of dovetails with it, is, I think we can, refer people to quick references that could easily deal with, the question of how is subsistent existence itself, all powerful, how is it eternal, how is it, I think those are kind of easy things to do, but intellect and will in God is something that's intuitively not that easy to grasp when you just start with the proposition of pure actuality or pure existence, uh, because intellect and will, it seems so different. It seems so categorically dissimilar.
Yeah, there I think like those I agree. Like the omniscience, just trying to analogically predicate something like intellect to the divine nature, that is a more difficult step.
Yeah.
Along with will. I mean, it seems like for intellect, you'd have to talk about some background ideas like
Universals.
Universals, and then also what's contained in the effect is what you find in the effect is contained in some way in the cause.
Yeah, they're the principle proportional causality. I think another way you can do it, I think you could one way you can do it, it's not the only way, but one way you can do it, I think that's a little bit quicker, is that you can start with will. And how do you start with will? Well, you can say that if God is pure existence itself, then it would follow that the creation of the world, which we have derived, could not have been a state of affairs whereby God was compelled to act to create created being, to create contingent being. He could not have been compelled to act because then there would be something prior to him that would have caused him to act, right?
Mhm.
And that reality that would have had to have been prior to him, well, then that would just be God. That would just be subsistence itself. So if we say that God is ultimate and he created the world, then he had to have created the world freely through an act of something very analogous to will in us. And if you have something that is willful, freely willful, it's very difficult to speak of will without also an analog for intellect. That you have a primordial subject that wills. So I think we need to predicate analogically the whole package of God, of intellect and will.
Mhm.
And I think that's a way to get at it. And I think it's a powerful one because I don't know how they could possibly explain how if God creates the world, if you don't if he doesn't have something analogous to freedom to do so, intellectual freedom by extension, you would have to, I think, posit something prior to God. But we've already established that as the metaphysically ultimate being, that's impossible because beyond him is nothing. So I think that's definitely a way to get at it.
Mhm. Yeah, like I was saying too, at least the one that Phaser develops in his book, that he tries to tie the universals back to being effects which are found in the cause in some way. And then we have a specific understanding of what universals are.
I think
the only other way they exist.
Your background in mathematics is probably helpful with that because if you're going to establish another way, you establish mathematical realism, right? Then that would certainly suggest that if you have these these abstract objects that are real in reality, that those would have to be sourced in God as well, and you can't a thing can't create what it does not in some way possess. So you have to have that too, right?
Yeah, because I also think that there are certain abstract objects which couldn't even principally be instantiated in nature, so they can only be ideas in an intellect. That's the only other possibility.
Yeah.
But there's another interesting line of thought too on this predication of intellect to God too. I think it comes from Avicenna that as you divorce more and more from materiality, from particulars into immaterial, then just the highest in immateriality would also be the highest in intellect. The function is abstracting things from particulars, from material, into the intellect, which in us we have the ability to take on many forms at once. Like we can recognize the form of red, the form of many different things. This is only possible in things which have intellect.
Yes, the mind in a sense becomes redness in that sense. Yeah.
So I thought that was one interesting, another, I guess, approach if you want to argue for God's omniscience.
Well, there are a lot of ways to do it, you know.
Mm-hmm. And that one comes from his immateriality, which there are other ways to establish that too.
Yeah.
Because obviously that which is material has to have composition in it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's true. Because that's a very good point there. Another one is this. I think maybe we could touch a little bit on because we're talking very abstractly. We're talking very philosophically. That seems in the minds of many atheists, I think reasonably, very far removed from anything that you would come to immediately visualize when you think of the word religion, when you think of the word Christianity, when you think of the word, or you plug in other religions. I think our arguments in a sense do beg the question to, in some way, fill that gap. It would take us hours to do it completely and thoroughly, but maybe we could say a little bit to that.
So is this the objection where the God of the philosophers really has nothing to do with the God of the average Joe?
The God of faith, yeah.
Yeah. So I guess in a way I would disagree with the very premise, because God is understood by average Joe certainly includes a lot of the things that we can establish by philosophical argumentation, certainly being first cause.
Right.
Certainly being something which it's not like other material things which can be moved.
Yeah.
Not even a material thing,
yeah.
Which is timeless, eternal, doesn't come into existence, it doesn't pass from existence. So I would even deny the premise to say that the God of the philosophers has nothing to do with the God of average Joe.
Right.
God of faith.
No, for example, yeah, like the average Joe, I'm sure if you asked him, you could say something like, do you believe in string theory or something? Or do you believe some established scientific fact that is widely accepted? No, string theory, probably not a good idea to bring up for that, but something that's widely accepted in the scientific community, but yet not easy to communicate to the layman. They'll probably say, "Yeah, I believe that," but do they know what it means? Can they really explain it coherently? No. They might have some idea about it, but they might have some inkling toward what it is, but they're not necessarily able to articulate it. And I think that's kind of analogous here, where we're talking about the same reality. They have glimpses of what we're talking about, but it still corresponds to the same referent.
Yeah, certainly if they include anything like first cause or that which is eternal, that which is timeless. I mean, we're already getting at something very similar to what someone like Plotinus talked about. He wasn't a Christian, and we're all talking about the same thing.
To get to Christianity, and this is what I kind of want to do with my channel, what I've been doing a little with my channel. I think there is a very strong connection you can make between natural theology on the one hand and the fundaments, the rudimentary fundaments of Christianity, of Christian philosophy, of Christian theology. The core of Christianity is essentially that God becomes man, that God unites to human nature in order to allow humans to have unity with him. Well, if we can establish that a number of things about God from reason, namely that he is the plenitude of being, right, and that being is the ultimately what goodness reduces to, and if that's true, then God would be the source of perfection as well, because I just earlier demonstrated that link between perfection and goodness, and those two in relation to being. Then you would necessarily get to the point that if God creates the world, God necessarily wills being to the world. God wills being to creation. Now, if that's the case, then it inevitably gets to the proposition that he loves the world. Since by love, in the Thomistic tradition, not just the Thomistic tradition, but the Christian tradition itself, would say that God, or they would say that love, rather, the Latin word is caritas, charity, in Greek agape, is none other than willing the good for the other. But if we've already established that goodness reduces to being, then it's also necessarily true that God wills the good to the world. God's willing the good to that which is other than himself is essentially the act of creation. Now, if that's the case, then would it not be fitting? Could we not, at least rationally, look at it abstractly and think that could very likely happen, given the logic of what we've been talking about, for God to communicate himself, that's being, to the world in a maximal way. How would this happen? Well, if you look at humanity, what is humanity but a compendium, a microcosm of the universe? It is intellect, will, which is one hierarchy. It's also sensation, right? It's also the vegetative. It's also the mineral. Humanity has all of those layers of hierarchy in one substance. And it would seem to me the best way for God to communicate his being, convey goodness to the world in this maximal way, would be through the incarnation, because it would be through God taking every single layer of being and uniting it to himself. And if we can think about this abstractly, detached from any religious tradition, we look in religious history, and we see a religious movement 2,000 years ago predicated on this exact principle, which they didn't articulate. They didn't really articulate that. There were 12 fishermen who there's this explosion predicated on that principle, on that idea. It seems to me that that presents a degree of reasonability that we can look at. Of course, look at it historically too. We have to verify it to some extent historically, but that, I think, provides a bridge between the philosophical and the theological in that sense.
Yeah, I think, when I was for a short period of time, I was also very intrigued by Platonism and Neoplatonism too.
Yeah.
And I think I had there's a line of thought I had which is very similar to this too, I think. Because, before, like, if you're coming from atheism into Christianity, from that point of view, Christianity makes no sense intellectually. But from the classical theist point of view, especially like a Neoplatonic point of view too, once you're thinking in that way, statements like we learn from St. John's Gospel that the Word becomes flesh, that makes sense. That that it would be fitting of the divine nature, which is supremely good, to that the principle of reason in that, the Logos, would be incarnated in a concrete way on Earth. So that's kind of the insight I had. That there are many things that would convince you of Christianity, but that was like one thing that convinced me that this is worth taking seriously. Like,
there's also
it's not nonsense.
There's also a point in metaphysics. There's also a point in metaphysics and philosophy that which produces an effect ontologically speaking, from itself, derivative from itself, is more like that source. And you see that in the Trinity, where God's total communication of himself, his activity, the first movements, quote unquote, if you will, of that activity are, the procession of the Trinitarian relations, the Son being generated of the Father, and the Holy Spirit proceeding from them both. If you take that principle and you just go a little bit beyond it to the created world, I think you would inevitably have the incarnation in that sense.
Yeah, so I think they're even just from a purely philosophical point of view. These aren't like deductive proofs that we're trying to claim.
No, they're not. With, but they are. Yeah. They're helps. They're grounds for reasonability. Mm-hmm. The fundamental reasonability of the Christian faith. And I think if you take that and you couple it with the historical arguments, right, that I think are pretty sound, the utter coherence of it, then I think that provides ground, at least to bridge the gap. That if we can start with this classical theism, and we can show how a reasonable person could go from A to B to C. And you could even tie back to the Old Testament, where if you have this moment where God communicates himself utterly through the incarnation, through the coming together of the divine and the human. Wouldn't you want to prepare for that in some way, from the point of view of the divine? So wouldn't it make sense for him to establish a people to pave the way for that? And then, very interestingly, how are we going to participate in that? How is humanity itself going to participate in that union between the divine and the human? Well, I think the church, Catholicism, certainly provides an answer for that. The sacraments, baptism, what does baptism do but incorporates you into what? The mystical body of Christ. Into that unification of humanity and divinity. It incorporates you into that, baptism. And the Eucharist, right? Those are definite, and I don't think that the gospel writers, when they were writing these institution of the sacraments, I don't think they were thinking of this metaphysical argument that I'm giving, but it fits the metaphysics. It fits it. It fulfills what I'm talking about here. The sacramental theology of the church. It's all accounted for, in other words.
Yeah, I think it was Chesterton who said that. I think he said this of the Catholic Church, that it has something in it for everyone. I mean, it has something in it for the average Joe. It has something in it for the nerds like you and me on the intellectual side.
Right, yeah.
But it's fitting in Christian history too, because you take a look at people like Saint Augustine and Saint Thomas, the great synthesizer of thought, where there's this large synthesis of what's going on in philosophy with Christian theology. I mean, it's not like this fideistic stuff that we say that you just have to believe.
Yeah, I mean, if you also take hylomorphism, which is the view that reality is material reality divided into form and matter. I don't know how many of the viewers are familiar with that, but it's a very abstract metaphysical system where you have form being what the thing is and matter being the individual participant in the form. So, like for example, triangularity, you have the essence of triangularity, and you have the drawn triangle, which would be the matter. That's a very rough outline of it. But that you have, I think, incorporated in a lot of St. Paul's letters when he talks about Christ and the church being the relation between the soul and the body. Soul and the body, of course, the soul is the form of the body, which is matter to it. So you have these confirmations, these uncanny, peculiar congruencies, with something that is densely philosophical, densely intellectual, by someone who I'm sure wasn't thinking about these categories to begin with, yet it fits.
Yeah. Yep. So there's, like I was saying, there's something in it for even the nerds like you and me.
Yeah, exactly. And you can see how it flows from one to the other.
All right. So how about I think I have another objection here too. I'm not sure if we covered this one already. How about this other common sentiment that well, the Earth is very small, and your universe is very, very big.
Yeah.
So what makes you think that there's a God at all?
Yeah. Well, I think, of course, it bears no relevance to the question of God's existence. I think it's much more fitted to like a question of why do you think God cares about? They often very crudely say, well, why would God, who created all these galaxies that don't think, by the way, that can't have a relationship with him, that can't think about him, why would all these why would he create all these galaxies and care about who you go to bed with it or what way? It's just the edgy Hitchens fans will resonate with that one. But it's interesting if you take the immateriality of the human intellect seriously, then in a sense, the human intellect in potency, in potentiality, can fit the whole universe in his head, in that sense, because he can in potency, in potentiality. I'm not saying that we can individually just figure everything out, but in potentiality, the human intellect can grasp the intrinsic nature of things in themselves. and for that reason, it can hover above, if you will, the galaxies, the planets, all of these things that are big on a macro scale, but when you look at it in terms of the hierarchy of being, they're below because they don't have the potentiality to hover above intellectually other objects, whereas we, given our intellect, do. And the intellect, the human intellect, since it has an inclination toward the attainment of truth itself, by virtue of that, necessarily has the inclination to know God in himself.
Mhm.
Doesn't mean we can attain it in our lifetime, but there is that inclination. And if the galaxies, they don't have that inclination because they don't have the intellect. But humanity has the intellect.
Mhm.
Humanity has that capacity, that the scholastics would call it the obediential potency, the capacity to know that which is beyond the limitations of your nature. That inclination to intuit truth as such, and in that act of intuiting truth as such, we immediately have that constant, infinite inclination to know the substance behind not any particular truth, but truth in itself, which is, of course, being in itself, because that's essentially the referent of a true proposition is reality. So we have the capacity to, the inclination to know the divine, to know subsistent being in itself. And for that reason, we immediately already have that relationship with God, that relationship of potentiality. And so, of course, it makes perfect sense to think that God, given that there already is that relationship via potentiality, that we would obviously see ourselves as relevant in that plan of creation.
Yeah, I think when I was an atheist or agnostic, I wasn't particularly fetched by that line of thought.
Mm-hmm.
How big the universe is compared to the size of the Earth. I think the conclusion I drew from that was if God exists, then he's quite broke. And who am I to say what's supposed to be in creation and how much stuff is supposed to be there or not?
Yeah.
I mean, for me, it never really had too much force, but it's something I hear
Mm-hmm. So
quite
I have to
often.
go soon, but I think one last thing we should probably tackle is the problem of evil. We should at least give a little bit of an answer to that one. Do you have anything to say on that?
Well, as far as I understand it, the problem of evil is divided into really two arguments. There's a logical problem, which says that the sheer existence of any evil whatsoever is in a logical contradiction with God's omnibenevolence.
Right.
And that's on the one hand. On the other hand, we have the evidential problem of evil, where the atheist is trying to say, well, there's some sort of evil out there which makes it probably the case that God does not exist. That there's probably some sort of evil out there which is totally pointless.
Yeah.
And on that ground, that would be in contradiction with God's existence. But that becomes more of a probabilistic argument that probably God does not exist. Perhaps we can perhaps we can tackle the logical one first, because that's kind of easy to dismiss.
Yeah, it is.
It's interesting to note. In St. Thomas's Summa Theologiae,
right.
He has this. This is one of two of his objections.
I can read it
but
out.
Perhaps you can read it.
It's pretty good. Yeah. Okay, here we go. It seems that God does not exist, because if one of two contraries be infinite, the other would be altogether destroyed. But the word God means that he is infinite goodness. If, therefore, God existed, there would be no evil discoverable, but there is evil in the world, therefore God does not exist. Now, that's a very good way to I don't know why, Dawkins really should have read the Summa, because he could have articulated that argument way better than he did. But yeah, I think the logical problem is I think the easiest to tackle, because I think Saint Augustine worked through this in his life. That was one of his big hang-ups about Christianity. About accepting Christianity was the problem of evil. Ultimately, he came to the conclusion that evil, as such, does not have positive existence. It is a lack of being, a lack of what ought to be. And in being a lack of what ought to be, it really doesn't make sense to say that there is evil here, there, as though it were some object in competition with, say, the baby who has cancer, right? There's this baby, and then there's this thing called evil that is that exists on par with the baby and interacting with it in that way. And it makes I think it's much better to speak of evil as a lack of what ought to be. So like a cavity in a tooth, right? Or a because when we speak of a defect, we can never define a defect except only through what positively exists, just not fully being actual in the way that it should be. When one has, say, heart disease, it's or blindness. Let's use the example of blindness. You really can't point to you can't say there is blindness. You can't take blindness and measure it. What you can do is you can measure the eye that is existent, and you can measure how it's operating. Is it operating in a way that is in accord with its natural end of sight? And if it is, then we would say that the eye is working well. If not, we say that it is working poorly or deficiently. That deficiency is only knowable in and through the positive existence of the eye and knowing its natural end, which does exist. So evil does not have that positive existence. It's only a lack of what should actually be there. I was thinking, like, why is there that lack? Why doesn't it behave as it should? The thing about that is, if you already concede that there is a goodness to the eye which is lacking through that deficiency, well, we already have the metaphysical principles that logically require us to lead to God's existence. God is the source of goodness itself. So if you have that, then really the question is just how do we reconcile with our inability to get at God's providence in the world? How is His providence consistent with these attributes that we've logically deduced? But it's not a logical disproof of God's existence, because in order to formulate the problem of evil, you have to concede. You have to use those same principles that demonstrate God's existence to formulate an argument against God's existence. So you can go ahead after that.
Yeah, another point about the evidential problem of evil too is that I mean, it's an important thing to talk about because it's more important, I think, at the emotional level than it is at the logical level. And that's not in a dismissive way, because I mean, we have very limited intellects. I mean, we don't really have a good sense of what the overall plan of nature is.
Right.
So, I mean, it's always easy to point to individual instances and ask, oh, why did it all? But the thing is, this, again, at the intellectual level, this argument from evil, once it's reached the evidential level, with a conclusion that probably God does not exist, the response, I think, from the classical theists is just to point out that the arguments which can be given for God's existence are deductive in nature and therefore follow absolutely from the premises, whereas that argument is only uncertain and that it goes to a probable conclusion. But the classical theist can also say, because I have a deductive argument, what I know is that there exists some reason for why this evil exists at all. It's there for some reason, but I don't know what it is. Yeah, I don't know what it is, but I don't have to provide that to you because that's not what the point of the argument is. The point of the argument was to say there is probably some pointless evil out there, but from the other arguments, I know that there exists a reason. It's just not known to me.
Yeah.
And once you say that, the strength of the deductive arguments that diffuses the evidential problem.
It does, yeah.
In my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, because if you acknowledge the deductive strength of the argument, then by definition of a deductive proof, you are chained to it. You're stuck with it. You have to. That's prior to any probabilistic inductive doubts that may arise from empirical phenomenon that seems to contradict what has already been established deductively. But if it's been established deductively, you're stuck with it.
Right. Yeah. So again, not to be dismissive of the problem of evil, because I mean, much has been written on the problem of evil. I mean, we can't possibly talk about all of it in a stream, but I think those are the main points.
Yeah.
With
it's interesting because logical and evidential. If we hold the principle of non-contradiction to be true, we already established why that has to be true. But what if you were hallucinating, and you really didn't know you were hallucinating, and you think you saw someone you knew at two places at the same time, in the same respect, that kind of thing, that would violate the law of non-contradiction? Well, you know one thing, the law of non-contradiction, you can't give that up. You may be in a confused state. You may be in a state where, like, well, how can this really be true? How can this be happening? How can this be squared with the law of non-contradiction? But you know the law of non-contradiction is true, deductively. The question is, how do you square it in your own experience? You can't give up the principle. You just have to accept, yes, on faith, but the faith is reasonably grounded in the deductive proof that there is some accountability for this.
Right. It just came to mind too. You mentioned Saint Augustine. I actually didn't know that about Augustine, because he was a Manichaean for much of his life too, wasn't he? So maybe that's why he thought like evil was like its own independently existent thing instead of a privation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's just one nerd point, I guess. But it's interesting because I was reading in Phaser's book that he's one of the great atheist philosophers of the 20th century, and I guess he admitted late in his career that he's a philosopher of religion. He said he doesn't take the problem of evil to be a conclusive disproof of traditional theism.
Yeah,
so
a lot of them
even
yeah. I think it's interesting. Alex Rosen, you and I, we often talk about Alex Rosenberg. For those of you who don't know, he's some atheist philosopher who has really taken it to logical extremes. He denies things like thought, conscious intentionality. He denies just bonkers mad, I think. But anyway, he was in a debate with Craig, and he said, if you can solve this logical, and I think he was touching on the logical problem of evil, then I will be Christian. And it just goes to show that this issue really it is pivotal. It really does hang on. It is, it is what their decision hinges upon very often. So it's very important.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think you said you had to get going pretty soon, so I won't keep you too much longer. So,
but that was fun. I enjoyed it.
Yeah. So thank you to the 15 or so people who were watching this, and have a good night, everyone.